Okay, I'm told we should start the proceedings for the day. My name is Upmanu Lal. I'm at Columbia in Earth and Environmental Engineering and at the Columbia Water Center. And I'm so grateful that all of you decided to come and join us today in what I hope will be the beginning of a partnership looking at solving problems related to water in America and beyond. We've been looking at America's water in a global context. And the general thing that we've been thinking about is that we started working at the Columbia Water Center thanks to the PepsiCo Foundation, who was our beneficiary at the point or a partner, looking at global water issues and how to address them. And at some point, the realization came home that if you don't address the challenges at home, you actually don't have a particularly good story to tell. So that's the context. And if you see, this is the wonderful picture of the Mississippi River with the American eagle that I was able to find when Googling for the Mississippi River. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that was most of the things we'll talk about today will not have ecosystem functions and navigation highlighted, but I wanted to put that up as the first picture because that's what it's really about, because the quality of life that we are looking for is going to be judged by how we perform in terms of the sustainability of the planet. And I wanted to acknowledge that. The other thing was, of course, why did I look for the Mississippi River? As a boy growing up in India, all I knew about America's water was from Mark Twain and the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. So you had to go there. There was no choice. So let me say a few things about what we are hoping to accomplish, because in the opening statement for the day, I want to just sort of give you a nice fuzzy feeling about where we are. So the initiative on America's water that we are trying to develop jointly with other universities and with industry, we want to see ways where instead of going around talking about all that ails us in Shakespearean terms, finding ways where we have the cure. And finding the cure means not talking about complexity, but talking about the interlinkages between different things that allow us to move the ball forward. So that's our goal. And we realize that to be able to do that, we need people who have different ways of thinking about it to come together. And it's not about a conversation. I'm an engineer, so it's hard to talk. This is one of the harder things for me to do. I would rather see ways by which we can come together in an enterprise where we are looking at this is the ball that has to be moved, this is the amount of money needed, this is the knowledge gap that we have to fulfill to do something. So this is where my selfish interest comes in. We are a university, we are an academic institution, which means our goal in life is to solve knowledge gaps. So we see ourselves sitting there and we see the rest of you pointing us to solve this. Okay, so that's sort of the orientation. Now, where we think we are going with this is we'll have the conversation today. The charge to the panels and the working groups is to stay focused to some extent on the domain that we are defining and walk us through where does this take us. Carl Ganter here from the Circle of Blue will be doing the lunch talk, and he's going to tell us all about the different facets of America very visually, and where it places it in the world and where we are with respect to understanding what we need to do. He will also help us write this discussion today up in a fashion that relates to society at large, but also gives us a working plan. We intend to have a meeting like this every year for the next several years, but we don't want this to be a series of meetings. What we want is for as many of you as have the capacity and the interest to work with us through the year so that when we present something at the end of the year, it is the joint product of what we are doing, and then there is a way to move things forward. What you'll notice is that we have a rather limited number of policy people who are here compared to the typical water meeting, and this is by design because we want to move the ball enough here where we have a common understanding so that we can then go to the policy frame rather than being told what we cannot do because of the different regulations that are out there. So that's sort of the structure. So having said that, I'll walk you through a little bit of the noise that is in my head, and then hopefully we'll sort it out by the end of the day. So moving forward, the way we've been thinking about it is if we look for what is the relevance of water for a particular nation? It could be the United States, it could be India or China. The main thing that comes to my mind is that this is one of those resources that is essential. There is a lot said about it. But at the same time, since the thing that moves nations is a trajectory of a GDP, the trajectory of a public welfare system, the trajectory of meeting environmental goals, this becomes a little messy because unlike energy and oil resources, this story about water intersects almost every story that you want to touch. So instead of getting into every one of those dimensions and then being watered down in anything that I have to say, I'm going to focus on this question. What are the technological, financial, and legal innovations needed for resilient water systems from city to nation? And the loaded sentence there is city to nation because there are people here who represent utilities. That's cities. There are people who represent larger goals such as agriculture, food, or energy. Vince Tidwell, for example, is going to tell us about water and energy as we go through. These become compartmentalized, and what the aspect that we lose the sense of is that there is a strong intersection between cities and the hinterland that intersects with them, and that hinterland represents food and energy, and the opportunities that we have at the macro scale are thinking about how water supply for cities intersects with water supply currently being used for energy and for food production. So it is city to nation, not city or nation, and not necessarily looking at a particular scale. So since I said that money moves the nation, one of the conversations that was new to me over the last 10 or 15 years was the strong emerging interest from businesses in water-related risks. Having worked in the water field since the 1970s, this was not something we ever talked about, frankly, but this has been the conversation. And it's been an interesting conversation because it starts out as a conversation which says we feel threatened in some way, but we don't quite understand how and why we are being threatened. But fundamentally, if you think about it, it's the bullet to the right that I have. Hopefully, I'm not going to do something bad there. So what we started seeing was that there was increasing competition across all economic sectors where they started seeing water, and it was not clear to them how to solve it because water was so cheap. So why is it that I'm getting punished for doing the little bit that I do for the use of water? And every single industry was subjected to that, more so in some countries than in others. But that's, I think, one of the interesting things comes up. This thing has vanished there. Okay. So there's also ecological outcomes. Are the ways by which we've been using water have not translated into a very nice trajectory for the environment. So those pressures then translate into attempts legislatively to try to do something about it. That also feeds into this particular story. Notice that I'm not even talking about the big drivers that have got in the middle. I'm starting at the periphery and working my way in. And the thing is that those two drivers now come in and really change the game. So the first is climate variability and change. Now that you can debate whether, depending on whether you're red or blue or green, as to what that aspect is. But you can't get away from the fact that if you're going to be hit with a drought, you have a problem, and that aggravates these issues. Similarly, what many people don't understand is that floods are actually at a larger scale, not the sandy New York City scale, but at a larger scale, they are very significant in terms of the impact they have. Back to the Mississippi River thing that I threw out. Then the second big driver is this aging infrastructure story, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. This comes most prominently in the form of city infrastructure, not just water, but all urban infrastructure. But what you also have to realize is that our larger scale water infrastructure, pipelines, canals, are also quite old, and we are not actually having the conversation about what happens with them. So those two drivers, if we view them in their most pessimistic sense, actually screw up everything. Okay? So that's why they are in the center. Now, if we look at options that might be there that would be fairly obvious. So, for example, California is in drought. We don't know when the drought will end. We didn't know when the drought was going to start. We could have thought about transactions between people who are not making that much money. I'm coming back to money, who are doing farming, and transactions between cities and transactions between the energy users so that you could adjust things a little bit. Now, the opportunity to adjust that is limited by our legal structure, which goes back to 1827, which is kind of interesting. So we have those parameters that constrain or provide opportunities for where we can go. Now, coming to the infrastructure story, what's been happening since Ronald Reagan, effectively, is that we have had decreasing in real dollars public financing for looking at water-related infrastructure. And so that has shifted the financing load to the local level. The local level's ability to deal with some of these things varies dramatically depending on where you are. And one of the things we found was that their ability to actually generate the revenue to pay for this is also limited. Now, as an engineer, I look at this and I say, aha, so even if we come up with radically new technologies to solve these problems, we have a little block here that we have to solve. But actually, the block intersects with all of this. If we don't do something about it, we face, as a society, increasing economic loss, whether it is from floods or droughts or pipes bursting every little bit. And we have increasing investment needs. So this is sort of the setting that we, I think, are sitting in. And many people talk about this, but hopefully the integral is more interesting than any one of the pieces that people usually talk about. Now, a few things here. This is a water stress map that we have done. In fact, Naresh Devineni, who's sitting over there, who's now a professor at City College, did much of this work. So the difference between this stress map, which actually was done in partnership with Veolia at Penero, right here with Growing Blue, the difference in this map and most other maps that you see is that this accounts for climate variability very explicitly. The unit of computation is day by day rather than averages. And the measure that is used here is that of long-term drought exposure rather than just mean exposure. Okay. So some of it is very familiar to you. The Midwest and California are in trouble from a drought perspective. But what's more interesting is if you look at the Northeast, if you look at the Southeast, if you look in Texas, every place where there's a large city, we have a significant exposure. That significant exposure is the intersection between those large cities and the surrounding areas which are agriculturally intensive. So that's something one has to recognize, and that's the message that we want to point out here. Now, if I move on, come back. Okay. So we know California is in drought. We've been reading all about it, so people know that. I'm not going to show you all the graphics associated with that, but to put that in context, this is from a drought workshop from last week in California from Janine Jones from the Department of Water Resources, and she ranks each year out of 114 years as to driest. So the thing to look at here is the years in the 12 driest years on record. They are all over the place. So you can talk about climate change, and I'm sure that plays an effect, is a factor in the whole story. But the point here is we have this exposure, whether or not you believe in climate change. So we need to figure out ways to deal with this exposure no matter what. So that's the climate drought story. This applies, frankly, to the Northeast as well. Sometimes when you're very comfortable because you think you have a lot of water, when you get hit with an exigency such as this, you call it a black swan event. If you're thinking about it, it's not a black swan event. Okay, whoa, what's our capacity? This is really trigger happy, okay. What's our capacity to deal with these things? Our capacity to deal with exigencies such as droughts depends on what storage we have. So historically, we built dams. That is how the West was won, so to speak. That is how the regularization of flows in much of the eastern United States, counting the northern and the southern parts, was done. But we stopped building dams, and for good reason, perhaps. But that's where we are, okay? So since the 1970s, we have been decommissioning dams, and the papers that you read in the academic literature are how do we optimally decommission dams? It's not about how do we actually do this problem. Now, what that has done is that it has put the pressure on our other store, which is groundwater. So in effect, what we have is increasing rates of groundwater extraction in exactly the areas where I pointed to the stress maps, and then we have groundwater depletion. So this, at the very least, increases your cost structure. In the analysis we have done of the national utilities, we find that the lowest cost supply to most of the water utilities for the cities was groundwater, and we have now transitioned away from that in much of the places. Sometimes because of environmental reasons, but sometimes because it's just becoming more expensive. Okay. So that's a gloomy picture, but you know what's very interesting is our population, that's the red line here, has been going up, but our total water use has been flat or declining. So this is where, when I talked to the National Academy of Science people and they wanted me to say that we are going to run out of water and we're going to hence run out of food and energy, my response was no, I don't think so. I think if we keep behaving as we have, yes. But if we actually start thinking about ways by which we improve the way we do things, I don't think we have a water problem. But it's an investment problem, and it's a problem of actually thinking about what is the best way to do that. So this decline in use per capita comes from improvements in agricultural water efficiency. It also comes from rather dramatic improvements in reducing losses and behavior at the urban scale. And also you should keep in mind that much of urban water use is actually outdoor water use, and that's where this has come. So moving to the second sort of storyline, which is the aging infrastructure. So what you read is the 1,000 main pipe breaks a year has now become per day on average in the country. And that particular story relates to the fact that most of these pipes had a certain life, depending on the material, and depending on when most of them got placed, we have hit this thing together. So the American Water Works Association, and this is, I think, relates to some work done by some of the people in this room as well, they come out with an estimate just for replacing pipes at 1.7 trillion by 2050. Nice number, right? Again, money. So when you see that, the question you ask is, okay, now if I add the other types of infrastructure that I also need to replace, where is this money coming from overall? You know, this is a measurable amount of our GDP on an annual basis. And how are we going to actually do this? And my reaction when I saw all this, because, you know, as an academic, I read these things, I'm not an advocate for one or the other, was interesting. But all the language that I'm seeing by and large is how are we going to replace this infrastructure? And why would I talk about replacement? I'm really much more interested in what should be our new designs for the 21st century, because that's what we do. There's also on the climate side talk of non-stationarity and changing risk and changing everything. Frankly, since the beginning of humanity, all we have done is change the planet. So we need to think about how we consciously change the planet rather than talking about why that is good or bad. So coming to that, there's the water energy intersect, and this is from Southern California now, analysis done by Dick Luthi at Stanford and the team at Renew It, which is the NSF project there. And I chose this because it's really a pointer as to where we are. So what they show you is current supply, energy cost. Energy cost, let's say, is synonymous with money cost, okay? Because as energy prices go up and down, that's what we'll hit. This is the energy cost of current supply into Southern California. What I didn't realize is the water transfers from the Central Valley are pumped over 120 meters. Okay. Now, if you think about that, that's very interesting, because for me to do current desalination is equivalent to using 100 meters of head. So this is like, you know, does this make sense? And one of the debates in California is, should we build another pipeline and do more of a diversion? So that's that. If I do recycled water, that comes in at about a third of that cost. And this recycled water is water you have and own, because that's your wastewater. If you do more desalination, that's the number associated with that there. So in terms of choices people make and money driving those choices, this is a very nice graphic. Okay. So what we've been thinking here is that maybe if you were to do more recycling and if you were to come up with new innovations, and what people talk about, this is a very busy graphic, so I'll just tell you exactly what the point is. The point is, maybe you can do reuse at the point of use. Maybe you can do it at the neighborhood scale. Maybe you can do rainwater harvesting, which is underneath Central Park, right here. Okay? And that's where the storage is. So what would be the economics of turning the whole game on its head and saying you have a very distributed system for everything? And I'm not saying that it's going to be better. I'm just asking that question. So, you know, what would be our designs from the engineering perspective? What would be the technical adoption issues? What would be the human response to this? And I'm not thinking necessarily about America here, because if you look at India and China, the movement in this direction is already happening. The movement in having each individual coming up with their own treatment system is already happening. So it's an interesting trajectory. One of the things that has fascinated me for the last couple of years is advances in things like graphene or filtration membranes. This particular graphic is from a paper that's cited there. And what's been happening with graphene, which was discovered in terms of being able to produce it by different methods in 2004 by Andrew Geim at the University of Manchester. And there's work at MIT and Columbia as well. The neat thing in this particular story is look at the rate at which water can flow through this particular membrane relative to the other existing membranes, and this is a logarithmic scale. So you're looking at a factor of 100 to 1,000 ease with which water moves through. That translates into energy cost, and that translates into, if you can actually make this work, which at the moment is a big question, you would not have to think about very much about the way water is treated. This would filter everything at a molecular level, and you would have very low energy costs. So reuse systems or desalination systems or whatever, you could do those. My take on this is that I'm not a physical chemist or a nanochemist, so I'm not going to be able to play in that game. But in terms of systems designs, this really opens up the vista on what you could do. So from a technological frontier point of view, and then linking that into the economic and acceptability design of these systems, this becomes very interesting. Now, clearly, if you were to do this at the point of use, you might also want to think about sensors that tell you that this thing is working well so that you don't have exposure issues. So what's going on in terms of trends? Because this was the setting. This is from Circle of Blues website. They run a thing called Choke Point USA, and so I took a few things from there. California clearly is looking at storage. They are looking at rainwater harvesting locally. They are looking at recycled water systems and increasing them. And at a national scale, we have much more irrigation, and we are going to need much more irrigation as the climate change scenarios play out. But the productivity associated with those and the productivity associated with the irrigation efficiency has also been going up. So that's a trend. So as you free up that water, the question is, what could that be used for? And how do you incentivize freeing up that water? In the Ohio Valley, in Cincinnati, and there's also a similar activity in Colorado, there's a water tech industry springing up and contributing to the local economy. So there are different ways by which you see this thing developing. And almost every week, I have someone from Wall Street call me as to what should I invest in related to water. So those are some trends. Okay. So what do I see? I see a significant potential for managing our water risks in terms of those 5 yellow bullets that are there. And I think what, in my view, is the knowledge gap is what intersection of these issues needs to come together for us to move the ball. So the first is improving water use efficiency across the board. The second is water rights innovation, which I think is important for allowing dynamic reallocation across groups. And also, frankly, in the academic literature, since the 1960s, we've been talking about the importance of the conjunctive use of surface and groundwater. What that means is when you have a lot of surface water, use it, inject it into the groundwater, and then take groundwater out in the dry periods. What doesn't allow us to do that is the water rights structure. Okay. Third is the financial and information systems innovations. There's very few financial products, such as insurance and derivatives, that are readily accessible across the board in the water sector, whether you talk about a utility or you talk about other sectors. To enable those, you need better information systems so that people can see what the exposure is and also what is the consequence of those exposures. So that, I think, is needed. We need investments in reuse and storage systems. I've sort of talked about that. And the last one is the innovation in these point-of-use systems so that we have optimized, resilient systems. So one comment I'll make across the board on this, and this was, again, work done by Naresh in India that was an eye-opener for us. India, as you may know, undergoes significant groundwater depletion and a lot of water stress everywhere. So what we did was we looked at how much of that could be alleviated if you simply grew crops in different places, maximizing the net farm revenue, constraining it so that you don't increase crop area in any district or county in the country, not increase irrigation either. But what would happen? And what he found was that basically you eliminate groundwater depletion in India simply from moving crops. The question that comes on that is, who's going to allow you to do that? And do farmers know what to do? But interestingly, what we found was the cropping pattern that was optimal was closer to the cropping pattern before the Green Revolution took place in India than it is to the current pattern. So we screwed up what 400 years of local optimization had sort of evolved to. So that's interesting because what it says is that if you actually put the optimization frame at different scales on the problem, you can start seeing opportunity there, which can then be monetized. So that's the message from that. So how do I think this will shape out? The way we've sort of been thinking about it in a project we have from the National Science Foundation on America's Water, which got triggered by an EPA report saying we can't figure out how to come up with the economic value of water. So we started thinking about how should we do this. So we are thinking that the dynamics of the human system may work something like this. You have the climate stress drivers, the environmental drivers, and these will lead to pressures that will lead to water rights reform and new technology and infrastructure. But those can't happen without price signals. And so the way that feeds into the system is the water rights now lead to trading mechanisms coming into place. We are seeing that happening in California and in the West. And as you build new technology and infrastructure, that has to be paid for. So there are price signals that come from those. As those price signals kick in, investors start seeing opportunity, so that closes the loop on that. And then with the trading mechanisms, we start seeing reallocation of water to higher value uses, which stimulates more conservation and efficiency in parallel. And now the regulatory system needs to play a role because they need to think about how this game should play out. At the tail end of this, to make this work, we need forecasting systems. People need to be able to see what happens with climate, what will be the outcomes of these sort of transitions to buy into them. And that's where the insurance and derivatives and allocation systems, which are new, are based on contracts like the energy system has. Now, I know Dan's going to talk about the human right to water, and what I want to flag there is we totally buy into that. We agree to that, but you know what? The total amount of water we need to sequester for the human right to water is not that much. So let's actually make a clean separation. We assure that. Similarly, we assure the ecosystem's right to water. The rest of it, now let's look at it as an economic product and see what we do with it. So that's the kind of innovation that I think can come. And it requires the development of appropriate business models, which at the moment I don't see out there. And that's what I'm hoping we'll have the discussion on. Okay, so last slide. So the question is, how can we tap the opportunity that is implicit in the story that I'm putting before you? I don't know how to do it. I'm putting that as the challenge for the panels and the working groups today. Each person here has their own way of thinking about it, and I think that's going to be much more powerful than my telling you anything there. So that's the charge. And we hope that this translates into a transformation in the US, and we can agree to be the agents of that transformation. And my interest is seeing if we can facilitate that and developing a new global water industry that can benefit from this. Because you need an example, and you could argue that we can develop an example in India and China where there's greater need, but there's also greater corruption and also interesting dynamics in how to get things done. And here, if we can argue that we are corruption-free relative to these other places, maybe we have an opportunity for demonstrating what can be done. Thank you for listening, and I hope this will be a wonderful day for you. I'm really excited about listening to everyone and learning from it.
Thank you. My head hurts whenever I hear Professor Lal speak and present. It makes me realize I've been out of school much too long. Gosh, so much information and so much data. Thank you, Professor Lal, for this opportunity, and thanks to Columbia. I'm going to take a very different tact. So I'm one of the first voices of business, if you will. We're shifting from an academic lens to a business lens, and we'll probably have a bunch of different lenses over the course of the day. Specifically, the food and beverage business. PepsiCo is the second largest food and beverage company in the world. What I want to talk about, although Manu stole my thunder, because you'll notice that I don't mention human right to water in this because it was supposed to be a story that I tell. However, I forgive you. How could you not forgive him? I want to talk about how we make water personal. And specifically, when you consider that a company like PepsiCo and other consumer products companies have tremendous opportunities for brand engagement of consumers. So we have over 1 billion opportunities every single day through our brands to engage with consumers. that's an unbelievable army of people out there. And it's great that they like Quaker or Tropicana or whatever the case may be. But if we can mobilize them for something that is toward societal good, like water, like climate change, like maternal health, like whatever the cause may be, that is a force indeed to reckon with. I think also that success is not only from understanding kind of the intellectual challenges and the economic challenges. That's very heady, and I said it sort of tongue-in-cheek when I first came up. But I think you also need to touch people's heartstrings. I think you need to touch them viscerally, because when you touch someone viscerally, that's how people really are spurred to action, I think. It doesn't come from the head, it comes from the heart, and ultimately translates into the hands, right? Real action on the ground. Whenever I give these sorts of talks, I know this is a very enlightened audience for sure, but I like to have at least a calibrating video that I call it. And this one that I'm about to show happens to be called Water in the Anthropocene. And it's just to make sure that everyone talks about the broad challenges that we're facing, not only within the United States, but globally, but certainly applicable to the US. Short video to get us all on the same page.
The global water cycle keeps our planet alive. The rivers are its arteries. Rivers run down mountains through forest, flow through desert and delta, course through bended bay and swerving shore, and recirculate back from our ocean. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation. Access to water has defined where human populations have flourished. Civilization emerged between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers on the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq. Now we are changing the carbon and nitrogen cycles. We are altering the global water system too, through damming, extraction, irrigation, and climate change. Many rivers no longer reach the sea. We move more sediment than natural erosion and rivers. We've built 48,000 large dams. We've drained half of global wetlands. We use an area the size of South America to grow our crops, an area the size of Africa for our livestock. Agriculture accounts for 70% of global freshwater use, and we need to feed a growing population. In a single lifetime, we've become a phenomenal global force. We're pushing Earth into a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, dominated by humanity. We have altered Earth's snow cover, sea ice, and ocean volume, fundamental elements of the water cycle. Climate change will bring more flooding, drought, and disease. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. This is causing the water cycle to intensify. Wet regions are becoming wetter, dry areas drier. Rainfall patterns are changing. Damming, mining, and extraction are causing 2/3 of major deltas to sink. Almost 800 million people have no safe drinking water. 2.4 billion remain without adequate sanitation. 1.7 billion people live in places where groundwater is being extracted faster than it can be replenished. 4 out of 5 people worldwide face risk to their water security. For water security for all, we urgently need innovative and creative approaches to policy from local to global. With nations competing for limited resources, we must find better ways to manage them. And we must adapt to a changing water cycle. This is the challenge of water in the Anthropocene.
There's something for everyone, as they say. I mean, just about any kind of crisis you can think of was mentioned in the video, whether you're interested in agro or infrastructure or policy or climate. Human health, everything is there, and it really emphasizes the interconnectedness that water has to so many of these crises and potentially easier ways for some solutions and some ways forward. This is a quote from the America's Water Initiative brochure. And I wanted to take a moment just to highlight some of the underlined phrases, and Manu mentioned them quickly in his opening remarks. Multifaceted water challenges in a truly multidisciplinary way. I mean, many people, many organizations talk about this. They've come to realize that no single entity can solve the water crises of water insecurity or climate insecurity or food insecurity alone. So obviously it requires multidisciplinary, multilateral discussions, helping us solve America's and the world's emerging water challenges. One of the things I first loved about the America's Water Initiative, when Manu was congealing it in his mind, was it was a decidedly U.S. focus. However, the intent and the vision was always to use that as an example for global action. And I think it's an opportunity for the United States to really show that kind of global action. But can there be a unifying framework? And this is where he stole my thunder, because this was supposed to be the big build, and now you probably know what July 28th, 2010 was, because he gave you a hint. Anyone know? July 28th, 2010? What was the hint that Manu gave you? Human right to water? It's actually when the United Nations General Assembly formally ratified water and sanitation as fundamental human rights. And they identified these 5 elements: safety, sufficiency, physical accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. And my challenge to you today, and there's going to be a lot of challenges today, both from the speakers, through the panels, and through the breakout sessions later on in the day, is try to think, as we go through the discussions, and as you look through your own lenses of what your expertise is, how can we potentially use this framework, which I think is pretty comprehensive, when you think of all of these things and the enablers that are necessary to make good on safety, sufficiency, etc. How can your role as an individual, ultimately making water personal, how can your role as an individual within your organizations, within your families, within your communities, help impact respecting, protecting, and fulfilling the human right to water? And I'd like to just go briefly through each one of those 5 elements. And as your wheels continue to turn, I would suggest that the underlined sections are the things that are the ones that I really want to focus on as we move forward in the presentation. Safety, I mean, in the U.S., thank goodness, because of organizations like the U.S. EPA and others, by and large, we are in much better shape than many other parts of the world. Not perfect by any means. I don't think anyone would suggest that we are. However, we're in much better shape. Safety has many different definitions, right? According to a very recent Deloitte review this year, which quotes some information from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, over 1.8 billion people today depend on unsafe drinking water. And you've always heard the number, the 760 or the 780, or close to 800 million people lack access to safe water. Well, there's a feeling that that is quite underreported, depending on how you define safety. If you're talking about meeting every one of the World Health Organization drinking water standards or guidelines, or the primary and secondary standards of the US EPA, I guarantee that number near 800 million rises. So this is a very real challenge. This, unfortunately, is what many people think about when they hear human right to water. They think about slums in India or China or somewhere in the developing or the emerging world. And these were actually photos taken by a former PepsiCo Foundation employee when she was on one of the site visits. And I love this in a way because it demonstrates the interconnectedness of water and sanitation, right? Nothing exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists or should exist in a silo or a pillar. Imagine a monsoon. A few years ago, Delhi had, I think, 3 feet of water in a 24-hour period. Imagine what that sewage stream on the right is going to do with 3 feet of water in 24 hours. It's going into people's homes. It's washing down into communities. When you add to that the fact that open defecation is still practiced by billions of people, you start to see the urgency of the safety component of respecting, protecting, and fulfilling water as a human right. These statistics are often quoted. I think that picture on the left has been seen many, many times, the dreaded sewage into fresh water systems. According to UN Water, 80% of sewage in the developing countries are discharged untreated directly into water bodies. And also UN Water suggests that nitrate from agriculture is the most common chemical contaminant in the world's groundwater aquifers. Well, this is the developing and the emerging world, right? We don't have to worry about that, and why does it apply to America's water? Well, there was also this study from UC Berkeley, and they talk about 1 in 10 people living in California's agricultural areas being at risk of exposure to harmful levels of nitrate. So it's kind of a little bit of a taunt, but I'm sure everyone in the audience recognizes that there are issues with the safety component of water as a human right here at home, which brings in the importance of the technological solutions that Manu and America's Water are advocating. The second element, sufficiency. Sufficiency, when you talk through the very direct, explicit lens of water as a human right within the UN, they talk about affected communities, and that is largely the developing and the emerging world, although not exclusively. And they talk about the necessity of 50 to 100 liters. And what I'm suggesting through this kind of advocacy and through the challenge that I place to you is that we look at the spirit and the letter of water as a human right. I think the letter of water as a human right is that 50 to 100 liters. The spirit of it is the individual role, whether you work for a company, a water user, a water purveyor, anyone. What can you do to positively impact the sufficiency component? Conservation, obviously, is kind of the intuitive answer. Again, this is what many people think about. They think about the ruptured land. They think about the Sahel. They think about places outside of the U.S. when you think about a lack of sufficient water supply. And then you see news headlines like Detroit, 26,000 homes being affected because of economic water scarcity, because people were not allowed or not able to pay for sufficient access to water, a very real problem within the United States of America. I want to share a second video with you, and this is admittedly PepsiCo-centric, but it's something that we believe can be lifted and shifted from a program that started in the United Kingdom in agriculture, and it's conserving water in agriculture, to other areas. The reason I bring this up is because I was speaking on a panel at the Columbia Social Enterprise Summit late last year with the Columbia Business School, and it was again about water. And one of the NGO panelists with me said, you know, one of the biggest things companies can do, the private sector can do, to help respect water as a human right is to use less of it, is to conserve it. And I thought that really resonated with me. So I want to share this video. It's about something called iCrop, and it brings in the technology lens because it's something that we partnered with Cambridge University in the UK to develop. And it's a way to direct water directly toward the root zones of plants when they need it and the exact amount that they need. And the tremendous water savings, I think, are quite astounding. So now when you talk about motivating business, right, one of the ways that you can motivate business is to have us, force us, cajole us, suggest that we develop quantitative goals, because they are remarkably motivating. And the reason iCrop was developed was frankly because our UK business came out with public commitments to reduce their applied water and their greenhouse gas impact by 50% in 5 years. And they realized, you know what, we're going to need something that's rather transformative to be able to do that within our agricultural supply chain. iCrop is allowing them to do that. And you saw that the video is a bit dated, so these are the new numbers as of the end of 2013. Continues to show progress. Why not lift and shift technology that works in one geography to other geographies, i.e. the United States? One of the things that drives our chair and CEO absolutely bonkers is when she'll travel the world and she'll see one of our plants doing something that is remarkable, and then she'll go to another place and the plant's not doing it. And she calls it lifting and shifting. And we've kind of adopted that terminology because while it's important to drive innovation and to develop new technologies and continue to improve technologies, there's an awful lot of that proverbial low-hanging fruit to reapply existing good and best practices. And I think that's one of the critical things that we need to do. And then physical accessibility. So this is how the UN defines it through the lens of the human right to water. What I wanted to share with you actually is a project that was led by the Columbia Water Center in Ceará, Brazil, in 14 or 15 municipalities. The reason I like it, there's a few reasons. One of them is it shows the importance and the intersection of bringing academic rigor, sound science-based solutions to a government organization. So with the government of Ceará, at the time this video was made, they embraced this scientific solution, and we had the policymakers' ears. So the policymakers understood the value of it. And when you can get sound science coupled with policy and coupled with making water personal, getting people involved and engaged in the water crisis and solutions to it, that's when you really move the needle in the right direction. Physical accessibility, not only is there kind of the making water personal part of it, but just to calibrate us, in one day, 200 million work hours are spent fetching water. So for a global company, for a multinational, you think about the productivity gains, much less the educational component and all of the other knock-on effects that you can have. And yes, this is true primarily in the developing and emerging world, but I share with you now the video from Ceará. And if you don't speak Portuguese, you're going to have to watch closely for the English subtitles.
É difícil falar da seca hoje. Para quem nunca veio ao sertão, porque a gente tem dois cenários no sertão, né? A gente tem um cenário de cheio do período em que há chuvas, que é esse que vocês estão vendo aqui em volta, tudo verdinho. E a gente tem um cenário que é completamente diferente desse, que é um cenário de seca. E o problema de acesso à água é muito forte.
2002, mais recentemente, em 99, esse própria sede municipal precisou ser atendida com um projeto emergencial de carro-pipa, de operações carro-pipa. Pior diria as comunidades rurais.
Aqui era difícil demais. Longe e ruim para beber.
A gente perdia muito tempo, muita hora de trabalho para encher o vasilhame que a gente tinha em casa.
Botava no jumento, tem as ancoretas, a gente botava e trazia para casa.
Mais de 1 quilômetro. Eu colocava 2 sacos de roupa no jumento e ia lavar lá.
Tinha uma epidemia de diarreia muito grande, né? Porque nós não tinha água de qualidade em canto nenhum, não tinha água encanada praticamente em nenhum sítio, né?
E agora, graças a Deus, a gente tem dentro de casa, né?
É uma pesquisa que envolve tanto a parte de abastecimento de água para comunidades rurais, como também de alocação de água. E do ponto de vista de obras físicas, esta foi a obra piloto.
O nosso foco é dar acesso à água à população.
Nós fizemos esse projeto em convênio com a Universidade de Colômbia, com o patrocínio financeiro da Fundação PepsiCo de Nova York, PepsiCo Foundation.
E se mobilizou bons técnicos, uma equipe significativa para levantar a base de informações, pensar sobre o problema. E hoje quem administra o sistema é a própria comunidade. Eles se organizaram em uma associação.
Nunca vi uma comunidade tão alegre do ponto de vista de ter esse tipo de acesso.
Algumas mulheres hoje têm tempo de ter lazer.
O próprio trabalho, a gente com água encanada, né, sobra mais tempo para a gente trabalhar, né? Saúde, né? Água é saúde, água é vida, né?
Foi mesmo cair do céu, né? Como é que a gente indicasse de uma vez?
And sensitive to gender, life cycle, and privacy requirements. That's a tough one. And that's a tough one if you want metrics around that. I mean, ultimately, the idea is that, like any human right, everyone should have that right protected and fulfilled, irrespective of gender or any other consideration. When I talk about a lesson learned and a hard lesson learned about that cultural, local resonance to water, I'm airing dirty laundry that we learned from at PepsiCo. And this was back in 2003, and it was something that happened in India, where there were claims, frankly, of water thievery from PepsiCo and our other beverage company competitor in India. And our initial response was absolutely not. This can't be true. I mean, we're responsible water users, and we have data to show that the water table is actually higher because of rainwater harvesting than it was when we started business. One of the things that we failed to take into account, which is applicable in the US, as applicable as it is in Kerala, India, is the local community component, the local stakeholder voice. Nestle Waters North America learned that many times over the years. In the US, you need to understand the stakeholder voice and sentiment. And it goes back to that acceptability component. It involves engaging stakeholders proactively so that you're invited into a community. You're not just tolerated or you're not just accepted. And this lesson was taking that local lens into account, because we had hydrogeologic data to show that those claims were in fact unfounded. It didn't prevent us from losing significant market share. And when we looked through that community lens, and we saw these poor women that had kids that were getting sick because of shallow dug bore wells and the water that they were abstracting from those, which is the cultural practice in this community. And then right next door, they saw truckloads of Pepsi and Coca-Cola and bottled water leaving our facilities every single day. What else could they think except that we were stealing their water? That's a lesson I will never forget. And the people that have gone through this understand what social license to operate and grow really means. In contrast, and this is, you always have to balance out a negative lesson learned with something that's positive, and I want to end on an inspirational note. This is a picture that same colleague, former colleague from the PepsiCo Foundation took several years ago in Tiruschirappalli, India. Over 10,000 women traveled as much as 4 hours each way to come to Tiruschirappalli, to sit in 120-degree heat in these tents for a full day, and guess what they were interested in? Water. They wanted to learn about water and sanitation, and we convened a stakeholder group there. We were flabbergasted with the turnout. We were expecting a few hundred people, local communities would come in. 10,000 people, mostly women. So you start to see the implicit links between gender, because it's women that manage the water in many of these countries. That was certainly something that balanced out the negative lesson that we learned. So what all of this has done for PepsiCo, and this is a bit of a PepsiCo commercial, I've tried to minimize that to the extent that I could today, but it has required us to take a comprehensive look at what water stewardship is. And whether it's watershed approaches with the Nature Conservancy, agricultural water use, which you all know is 70 to 90% of global water withdrawal, community engagements, which are so critical to building and strengthening that social license to operate and actually thrive or flourish, direct operations, which is where the conservation component comes in, and then extending that to the supply chain. And a really important one is advocacy and engagement. More and more companies are being expected by external stakeholders to be very public advocates, whether it's for climate change, whether it's on the road to Paris for COP21, whether it's about water insecurity or food insecurity or health insecurity. We have the unbelievable luxury of helping to move the needle through our influence when that's directed in the right way. And we believe there's an opportunity to do that in the water space for sure. So, the hypothesis coming in, can we make water personal? Or rather, I think we need to make water personal. I would say that, can we afford not to? And I challenge you as we go through the day to think about what we've talked about in those elements of human right to water, not the letter, but the spirit. And how can that impact? How can that be applied to what America's water is doing right here at home? Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Dan. The very first thing I was thinking of as Dan was talking was, I need to find a way to give Margot a bonus for having me talk before him instead of after him. So I think this is probably a good time for the two of us to hear from you.
Sure.
And I think you heard different lenses on the same story. In the beginning, I was being self-congratulatory because we asked Dan to come and give a talk, and he's making all the points that I should make, but I don't know how to make. But hopefully that gives you two different ways of looking at these issues, and that stimulates enough of a set of questions.
Lise Del Bauman, PepsiCo Director of Water Stewardship, and you're not a plant. Uh-oh. Get out.
How do you both reconcile local and big scale? I mean, so Manu, specifically with respect to water policy, which across the U.S. is just a nightmare, right? It's different in states, it's different in cities. Dan, with respect to lift and shift, water's local. So how can you expect just to take the same answer and keep reproducing it?
Go ahead. Give me time to think.
Okay, no, sure. So the way I look at it is that you do have the policy lever, and I deliberately didn't want to touch that in the beginning because that's been the bottleneck to some extent in this thinking. So if you think about what I was pitching, on the one hand, I was saying the local goes hyper-local, right? Because if you go underneath that. On the other hand, I was saying that the city's intersection with the surrounding areas in terms of water competition has now become very apparent, right? So am I arguing that the Great Lakes water needs to go to Denver? No. So in that sense, water is local, but in the sense of how we set up the principles for transacting water or making it available across uses, in that sense, it's a national issue. And in terms of technology, obvious, right? Yeah.
And I think you've never asked that question before, Lise. I think the global level is particularly applicable to things like advocacy and awareness building. And I kind of started off with making it personal. If PepsiCo, with our global stature and global presence, can in fact start a campaign around water, it doesn't matter where the consumer is located. If we can make water sexy, if we can make solutions to water insecurity sexy and fun and engaging, I think that will resonate with consumers across the board. So there's kind of a global lens. I think the lifting and shifting part, as you know better than all of us, there are absolute challenges in terms of investment, in terms of culture, in terms of all of that. But I think we're starting to see that needle move in the right direction with things like the whole membrane bioreactor, right? It's a water treatment system that's allowing us to reuse and recycle a tremendous amount of processed water in our facilities. Started in Tingalpa, Australia, expanded to Casa Grande, Arizona, which is now kind of the gold standard plant. And it's a showcase for this kind of incubator of technology. And now it's in a couple of plants in Latin America. So is it easy? Absolutely not. But I think that's where the lift and shift can be tailored to individual local needs.
The last slide that Professor Lal showed, I don't know if it's possible to put it up again, but it basically says there's a bunch of challenges, and then it says there's technology, and the way you'll get to the technology that to deal with the challenges is by, in the middle, having price and markets and risk. And yet, the who, in all of the stories, there was no who in the diagram. There's no, and then the last point that was made was at the local level, oh, we'll gather people together and we'll explain stuff to them. And at the national level, we'll have advocacy. And at the global level, who knows how we're going to engage whoever has to be engaged. My sense is that at the top of the agenda is the development of as clear a set of ideas to test and theorize about with regard to engagement of stakeholders, not just as the recipients of information, not just as the advocates of their own interests, but in a process of collaborative problem solving at the local level, state level, national level, regional, national level, global level, that will require as much intellectual investment in saying, how do you identify the stakeholders? Who can speak for them in an ad hoc case? How do they engage in joint fact-finding? How do people sitting under the tent, engage in problem solving and not just be the recipients of information? How do we take the results of all those informal processes and collect them and connect them to the world of formal decision making? Where's the public learning that leads to collaborative adaptive management? All of that is about process of engagement, and it's not just gathering people together to hear stuff under a tent, and it's got to be in the theory of practice we have. It's not that everybody's a consumer and markets will find a way to engage them. What's your thinking about how we begin to do better to engage all stakeholders outside of the formalities of government, but in connection with that, in collaborative problem solving and joint learning?
So I presume this is directed at me.
Go ahead.
First of all, I have no dispute with what you're saying at all. Okay, I acknowledge that this is a need. On the other hand, every problem, and you have to remember I'm an engineer and I'm not as adept at talking as you are. So, but here's the response. No, I'm not excusing the engineering side because we talked to John Young. Engineers seem to be like chameleons, right? So, the point I would make is this. At every enterprise that I look at analytically, and this is what I'm doing. I'm looking at this problem analytically. Where do I make my first cut at something that then translates into a scalable process? Taking on stakeholder engagement, for me, does not translate into that. However, if someone wants to participate in that, I'm very happy for that. Okay, and the reason I say this is the following. I've had quite a bit of opportunity over the last 6 years in intersecting with high-level government officials up to the prime minister level across the world. Okay. They want to know from you right away what is the solution to their problem before you have understood their problem and before they have understood their own problem. Okay? So in terms of stakeholder engagement, I learned that. Okay, that this is the first thing I have to solve. So what I'm talking about with America's Water is, do I have an understanding of the problem that I'm trying to solve at a technical, economic, and social level? And my answer is no. So I am not ready to go to the stakeholder people and engage them until I achieve that. That's the spirit in which I made my initial remark.
And Dr. Susskind, I mean, I'd love to learn from you as we kind of move forward in examples of things that have worked well in that regard, because I think many companies, including PepsiCo, are struggling with how to do that substantively and how to do that sustainably over long term. I think the kind of convening is a good first step because at least it allows you to kind of build awareness. You absolutely need to have that sustained dialogue going forward. I want to share one quick example, if I may. It was something that we learned through one of the PepsiCo Foundation partners called the Safe Water Network. PepsiCo Foundation was a founding member of that with the late Paul Newman several years ago. And they had the idea of market-based approaches to people near the base of the pyramid, not quite at the base, but near the base, because they think that that was a more sustainable model than traditional philanthropic approaches for the provision of water. And so far, I mean, I think we're thrilled with the progress and the learnings that we've gotten through that partnership. I mean, I consider them kind of a gold standard partner. But early on, they were opening some water stations in Ghana, in Bukwase. And the water that the community was drinking at the time was way darker than the color of the podium. I mean, it was as dark brown as you could imagine, with no treatment. And they were drinking it, and of course there were, horrific data all about disease, different diseases, Buruli ulcer, and the various waterborne illnesses that you can get. Safe Water Network went in with the water stations, and the water that resulted was what you would have, on the table. It was as clear and crystal and guaranteed safety to the extent that you can with the water treatment process that was being used. We couldn't for the life of us understand why there was no uptake in the community. Because here we are, and you say you can't just tell them. Here we were telling them that this water is safer than the water that you've been drinking for thousands of years and that your parents drank and that you're feeding to your kids. This is safer and better for you than the water that you've always been drinking historically and culturally, and kids aren't going to die when you drink this. And we thought, that's all you have to do is tell them that, and immediately they're going to have this epiphany and want to drink the water. And they didn't. And we troubled over this actually for quite a few months. And then Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School actually sent some students in on the ground in the communities, and they did that community engagement. And you know what they found out? The slight residual odor of chlorine was so different and so foreign to them. And that's not something we addressed. It's not something we even told them to expect. We were so used to it being in the United States with chlorination. We kind of knew the benefits of chlorine kind of outweighed that mild sensory organoleptic property. Once we took that into account and understood it, and then we were able to engage them and teach them, we saw this dramatic uptake in the water that was coming out of these water stations. That's just one small example, but it is quite a challenge. And I think there's so many levels of that engagement, whether it's the 2030 Water Resources Group, which is good at doing hydroeconomic analysis and convening high-level stakeholders, but then how do you convene those other stakeholders, the really important stakeholders at the community level, the ones that, particularly with human right to water, are those affected, impacted communities the most? I don't know that anyone has a good answer to that, so we're looking forward to your thoughts on it.
Tony Coleman, a question for Dan, which is about the measurement of green water in terms of efficiency of food production. As we all know, 90% of consumable water goes for growing food, 10% for everything else, and of the 90%, 70% comes out of green water, which is rainwater. To what extent are you moving forward in terms of measuring and ensuring farmers get paid for looking after the green water? The new NASA satellite that went up about 4 weeks ago is looking at soil moisture. Are you working to perhaps develop iCrop further to be able to measure the use of green water and encourage its retention? In the US, big move to no-till. It was in the New York Times yesterday, but I haven't seen any engagement by organizations like PepsiCo to encourage the more intensive use of green water and keeping green water up front as the key thing we need to look after.
So Tony, I'm gonna answer, and then I'm gonna see if Lise has anything to add, particularly in the construct of kind of the water footprint and where we sit with water footprint. But it's a complicated answer, and I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. But it falls under our sustainable agricultural initiatives. And one of the things that we're advancing across PepsiCo is something called the Sustainable Farming Initiative, which is a framework to look at social, environmental, and economic practices at the farm level across the world and across crops. We purposely designed it over the last 4 years to be crop agnostic, to be geography unspecific, so it can be applicable and customized anywhere in the world. Part of the environmental indicators, obviously, are a variety of indicators and practices around water. Now, I don't know that we specifically call it green water, but the intent is, along this continuous improvement journey with the growers, is to do exactly what you're talking about, which is to improve their awareness about, not all water is created equal, and to assure that they have access and are applying the best practices for agricultural water use on farm. Now, it's a long journey, so we just started rolling that out. I think we're at close to 1,000 growers, and I mean, obviously we have hundreds of thousands across the world. So we're looking at it as at least a 5 to 10 year journey. That level of granularity will come a little bit later in the journey, but it's definitely on the docket. Lise, did you have anything to add about the green water specifically, or?
Yeah, without a mic, I will just yell.
Sure.
So PepsiCo, there it is. Thank you. Several years ago, we joined the water footprint interest, right? So we were part of the Water Footprint Network. And our big learning out of that was that you cannot benefit much from adding together green, gray, and blue for a product. And our big epiphany takeaway from the whole water footprint discussion was, you know what, you need to understand where you're using water and what the level of stress is there. And so since then, we are now understanding, okay, how do we prioritize? How do we figure out where it's more important to look at green, blue, the balance between green and blue, which of course can change if you have a drought and so on. So we're still kind of, we're on a journey. We're grappling with where do we need to focus first, rather than saying we're going to do the same thing everywhere. We're going to say green water, you know, this goes back a little bit to my earlier question. How do you balance global, local? We're figuring it out.
And for those of you on this side of the column, Paulina just held up a not so subtle sign in red that said time. So I guess that was the last
So we take a break. I think the break is next, right? And then the panel starts. So let's take a break, and that'll give a chance for people to assault us individually.
And what time do we reconvene? What time?
15 minutes.